And it's a pleasure to be here. I should warn you that we are going to be turning this panel into the interview session of the Steptoe Cyber Law podcast. We'll probably cut it off when we get to the questions, but I can't guarantee that, because if they're really good questions, we'll include them, but that might make it a little long. So we'll just, I propose we just jump right into it, because we got a lot that we ought to cover. I think you're all familiar with our panelists. At least I hope you are. They're mostly technical folks with deep cryptographic and security backgrounds, except for me and Kiran Raj, who both of us are mainly distinguished by our government service. But I'm going to, because of that, I'm going to give Kiran the chance to jump in and explain going dark from the government's point of view, from the FBI's point of view. We heard Jim Comey, but it seems to me that as the Apple case has evolved, exactly what going dark is and exactly what the problem is with Apple have started to get a little confused. So what is the problem with encryption from the government's point of view?
Sure, thanks, Stewart. And let me, I know people are interested in the Apple case, and so let me just put a frame around the going dark problem and hopefully fit that case in to help folks understand, at least from our perspective, how it fits in. So for us, when we think about going dark, generally we refer to it as the government's inability to obtain critical information in electronic form, even though we have court authorization to do so. So that definition actually covers certainly encryption, but it also covers a lot of non-encryption issues as well. And I just want to pause briefly on that, because I think that's something that gets a little bit lost in the discussion, where folks tend to focus generally on encryption. So just a couple of quick examples of a non-encryption going dark problem. One is data preservation or data loss. So that's a situation where the government will go to a provider with a court order or a search warrant, and the provider could say, we had the information, it was unencrypted, we could have provided it to you, but we no longer have it. It's been deleted, it's gone. Another example is the technical inability to segregate information or provide information. So that's a situation, for example, where we might go to a real-time communications provider and say, can you give us metadata? And they'll say, we can't give you that specific metadata on the target that you're looking for, because we just don't have an ability, a technical ability, a capability to give you that information, even though we see that you have a court order that authorizes you to get that information. So those are two quick examples of a non-encryption problem that we have.
Kiran, let me push you on that, because it's always been the case. You ask for evidence, and somebody says, "Oh, I threw those files out last week." You're just out of luck, right? Or if somebody doesn't collect information, serving them with a subpoena, saying, "Well, we thought you would," doesn't strike me as a going dark problem. It's just the way the world is.
Yeah, it's not so much that they don't collect the information, Stewart. The situation is we're seeing technology evolve in such a way that there are new risks and challenges. So it is true that on a principle level, yes, if two people were whispering in the woods, the government wouldn't be able to figure out what they said. But that doesn't really answer the question as to, in a new environment where we have all this change in technology and more people communicating and critical information existing in that space, how do we deal with those added risks, and how do we affect those, or how do we think about those? And so those are just challenges that we have from the government perspective. But let me go to the encryption piece. I think that's where we'll spend the most of this panel. So we tend to think about encryption in two different buckets. One is the data in motion. So that's things like instant messaging, real-time communications applications, teleconferencing applications, things of that nature. And the second big bucket is data at rest. So that is things like devices, USB sticks, cloud services, things of that nature. And so in that bucket, the data at rest is really where the litigations that folks have been focused on, and that's really where that sits. And if you think about it, that's really, those litigations affected one aspect of one part of the overall going dark problem, and really even for that particular company, it was only one particular product line, and even in that product line, it was only a couple of combinations of hardware and software. And so just to put it in that frame, I think it's important for people to understand how we think about the overall challenges here.
You know, I think it's a little disingenuous. I keep hearing, oh, this is only going to be one thing, one phone. You know, the moment you got a hack on that phone, I saw a letter go out to every single state, local, federal, Indian tribe, law enforcement agency saying, now that we've got this one, got any more for us?
This is the inimitable Dan Kaminsky speaking, for those of you who don't recognize the voice from past podcasts.
So you know, I understand that this particular case was certainly focused on one, but that certainly didn't reflect the behavior as soon as access to that one was acquired.
Yeah, I think, Dan, you're talking about opening Pandora's iPhone as well, right?
I mean, I think it's always the case that we want to work with our state and local partners. I mean, again, if they have cases where they're trying to access critical information to help victims, to solve crimes, I think that's a situation where, if we can, the federal government does try to help, again, within the lawful means that the Congress has set forth. But I do want to explain, you know, that is the overall framework of going dark, but it's important to understand that, you know, and this is probably obvious, but important evidence is increasingly becoming electronic. It's in electronic form. And in fact, nearly every criminal investigation that we undertake at the federal level relies in some part on electronic evidence. And so when we think about how does this affect our investigations and prosecutions, you know, I want to maybe give 4 categories just to help folks think about, you know, how that the inability to access this information might affect the investigations. The first is the inability to prevent crimes. So that's a situation where, had we had access to the content of or specific information, we might have been able to prevent a crime.
Now, that's really just a data in motion problem, isn't it? I mean, the likelihood that you're going to stop a crime that you don't know about by seizing a device is pretty low, right?
Well, I think that's unfair. I think we prevent a tremendous amount of crime in the first place because the attacker only acquires encrypted information. Like, hey, you know, the bad guy got the hard drive and it was random noise to them, and so the crime doesn't happen. The crime is prevented.
Okay, so I guess I'm thinking about a scenario, I mean, just as a hypothetical, for example, you can imagine a scenario where we're up on a wiretap pursuant to, you know, a wiretap order. And in the past, had we been able to, you know, we'd been able to see what the 2 bad guys had been saying. And they say, okay, at this time, we're going to meet at this particular street corner, and, you know, we'll sell 5 kilos of cocaine, and there'll be an exchange. Like, that might be a situation where, had we had access to the content, we could, you know, prevent the crime. So that's just one category. Again, I just want to talk broad strokes, and we can get into details. The second type of category is the inability to sort of solve crimes. And so that is a situation where we don't have enough evidence to be able to show to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that an individual or set of individuals committed a particular criminal activity. That's the second category. The third category is diversion of resources. So this is a situation where maybe in a particular high-profile case, it's all hands on deck. Like, everyone's going to focus on this to figure out, we need everybody involved in this investigation and to get access or get information, because the place where that would normally be the easiest is not accessible, so we have to go find other information. That diverts resources potentially from other cases and investigations. And the fourth category is one of delay. So this is situations where investigations, we might ultimately be able to get access to the information, but it is delayed, whether 4 months, 6 months, or longer, and that might have consequences for the investigation.
So let me stop you there, and I'll ask Zuli Ramzan to jump in with an industry or a cryptographer response to those complaints.
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think it's important to look at the overall context. We talk about going dark, but I think if anything, we live in this golden age of surveillance today where there is a plethora of information about us. In fact, I would argue there's no paucity of data. If anything, there's an overabundance of it to the point that we don't know how to manage it from a national security level and how to even deal with that. So that's the first element. And then the second element, and I think Dan touched upon this, there's this fundamental issue of, yes, I would agree, on the one hand, we want to help law enforcement. Obviously at RSA, we try to protect customers, protect their networks. We want the world to be a safer place. We have that common mission in mind. But then the question becomes, do we have the means to achieve it in a way that's safe and sane? And I think from a cryptographic perspective, we don't yet have that means to be able to do that in a way that's going to be safe. If you talk about things like exceptional access, which has been the key buzzword du jour after the whole Apple FBI case, to me, that's something we have not academically figured out how to do. In fact, we found a lot of issues with trying to do it successfully. As a cryptographer, as a cybersecurity person, I can tell you, we do not know today how to design truly secure systems. We get this wrong all the time. Experts make mistakes. When you talk about...
Let me stop you there for a second, because you've had 40 goddamn years to build secure systems using the engineering approach, and 20 years where encryption was basically decontrolled. If encryption was going to solve our problem, shouldn't it have solved it by now?
Well, let me put it this way. We have law enforcement, we have burglar alarms, we've got security cameras. Does crime still exist? I would argue yes.
We do not try to protect our stuff and our people by building bigger forts around the houses that we live in. And yet that's what the engineers are telling us to do. Oh, just one more fort and we'll solve this problem.
In fact, I would vehemently disagree. The goal is not to build. In fact, I think taller walls and deeper moats are not going to solve anyone's problems. They'll keep a little bit out. But the reality, and I think Admiral Rogers touched upon this earlier, it's no longer a question of, when you're going to, if you're going to compromise, it's when you're going to get compromised, because we are dealing with an adaptive adversary, somebody who has both the means and the motivation and the desire to try to compromise systems.
And the crypto is pretty much useless for preventing compromises, isn't it?
I wouldn't say it's useless.
If it was so useless, why are you having to spend $1 million to break it?
Right. So it works great against getting contents, but most crimes are not crimes of gathering the content of data as it travels or pulling it off your computer. They're breaking into your system while you're using it, while you're looking at data, and they're taking the data from you by social engineering or otherwise getting you to compromise the data in ways that the encryption is not protecting.
Yeah, what we're seeing here is that encryption
This is Patrick Henry, I should say, another cryptographer who has background at GCHQ and at NSA, I think.
So encryption is a security mechanism, but what you're really trying to use it for is access control. So the underlying thing that you're trying to manage is access control, and encryption just happens to be the technical mechanism by which you do that. And managing access control in a sane and rational way is very hard. One thing we've done in the last 40 years is package encryption to the point where you don't need a PhD now to implement the algorithms. The algorithms you can just grab off the shelf, but you still need to use them correctly. And doing so is hard, and spotting flaws is hard. I give an example to some people, like prospective new hires. It's like 10 lines of Python. It instantiates an AES algorithm, gives it a key, gives it an IV, gives it some data, encrypts it, prints out as it goes, and I say, tell me what's wrong with it. And people, even respected colleagues, look at me and say, I can't see what's wrong with it. Well, what's wrong with it is that you've got a 64-bit key that you've encoded as hex. And you've given the algorithm something it wasn't quite expecting, or done something in a way to degrade the security that is hard to detect.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's the reality that building secure systems is hard.
Now, you've said that I agree with you, since the engineers have failed for so long.
Why is it just us that have failed? Why is it just engineering that's failed?
Well, because I think it's the engineers who've told us what security is and how to get it. And they keep saying, if there weren't for these idiot people getting in the way of this perfect system I designed, we wouldn't have this problem.
Well,
I wouldn't say that at all.
Here's the thing. First off, we've only been doing this for a fairly short amount of time. The iPhone came out in 2007. We've been building bridges and buildings for thousands of years. And until fairly recently, they burned really frequently. There's still a lot of work to be done. Part of what's happened only fairly recently is just everyone started putting all of their data on our toys, okay? This internet was designed not for, global economic work. It was designed to move pictures of cats. It just happened to be the thing that worked best. So, give us a bit now that there's actually consensus. And I have to point out, as much as there's consensus that the internet should be secure, now that we're starting to build actual secure systems, really making progress on the hardware foundations. Cryptography is about creating a foundation for security. It doesn't establish anything useful any more than Bedrock does. But good luck building anything good without Bedrock.
So the security is the security that's provided by Apple, which recently disclosed that all you had to do was change their device clock back to 1970 and it would brick your machine, or that silently stopped doing security updates for QuickTime for Windows. These are the guys who are protecting our security.
It's not about 2016. It's about the increasing trend line towards an actual secure infrastructure. It's about seeing things in 2018, 2019, and the question of, in 2019, are we going to have to do breach reports when someone loses a phone or not? Which one is the desired end state? And there's a debate, and that's the debate we're having.
Okay, kind of building on that, I do think there's a fundamental point here, which is that complexity and security are antithetical to each other. We are talking about highly complex systems. As they get more complex, we tend to find more security flaws. That's no surprise. I think what we're trying to say is that if you now have this already complex system, and now I'm going to make it even more complex by adding additional requirements around things like exceptional access and whatnot, I shouldn't be surprised if I can literally would break the very foundation on which we rely upon.
There's been a lot of talk about how it's... Yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
jump in? Because I do hear the term exceptional access and sometimes magic unicorn key and other type of things from folks in the security field. And one question I have for them is, when we look out empirically at the private sector today, we see a number of companies, in fact, many companies even in this room, that use encryption on the one hand and yet can maintain access to the content on the other. So we have situations like email providers, for example, who they do it for actually a number of reasons probably. One is for business purposes to sell targeted advertising, but another reason too is for security purposes, right? They scan emails for malware, they scan for spam. And so I guess one question for the security folks is, have folks done a study to say that empirically speaking, when you have a system where only the end user can access the information, it is more secure? Because one could imagine in the email provider example, it may actually be more secure to allow the email provider to have access to content so that you're not inundated with spam, that you're not getting malware attached to your emails. I mean, I just don't know. It's a question.
I think, Roger, so it's a very nuanced debate. I think we're getting at the heart of that debate and why it's so nuanced and complex. And I would agree that, yes, in certain scenarios, there are benefits to allowing, let's say, third-party access within certain confines. I think the challenge becomes when you try to make that much more broad and much more extensive.
But now
much
you're
more complex.
arguing not against complexity, but against complexity that helps the FBI, aren't you?
Well, no. I think I'm arguing that if you get to a point where there is significant complexity, and now you're talking about the potential of making, let's say, every iPhone or every device less secure, we're not talking about a fundamental weakening of the infrastructure that we all rely upon.
So let me ask this.
Can I break in on the exceptional access thing? Because I think it's fairly easy to build an exceptional access system while having encryption, sort of full disk encryption. And that's when you think of the point of the encryption is for access control. And all you need is a way to provide an access control token to the device to say, give me access. And normally this is a PIN. Occasionally you could have something where Apple signs something with a key that they own, that they don't give to anybody, that says, unlock this device, not before this time, not after this time. There you go, sign that.
Don't they have that now? That's how they send us updates. Apple
Well,
has exceptional access,
No,
don't they?
it would have to be distinct from the update system.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually that easy, because now think about what you've done when you allow for, let's say your sort of strawman exceptional access system. All of a sudden, you've thrown out things like perfect forward secrecy, which is no longer possible. You can't do things like authenticated encryption, and that's just the technical side of things. When you talk about the operational side, the key management elements, how do you decide jurisdiction? How do you decide who gets to decide who is going to allow for exceptional access and in what cases. How do you deal with international jurisdictions? So I think that there's certainly technical elements. You can address some of them, but not others, but you've got to be able to be clear about what you're willing to give up. Then there's operational elements, which now, again, you've got to be willing to decide and answer a lot of fundamental questions. I think the challenge that we've seen is that we have engaged in this exceptional access debate without maybe a clear understanding of how we're going to answer a litany of questions along those lines. I think if we had those answers, we'd be able to maybe have a more intelligent and a deeper debate around this issue.
Well, so it's important to look at where the predecessors are for exceptional access. SS7, the signaling system for the telephone system, has been a security nightmare and has been left a security nightmare with intent.
Absolutely.
You look at law enforcement, you look at hard drives. You know, hard drives have been getting exploited for decades. And we could have had a world where intelligence said maybe we shouldn't have every hard drive in every government institution and Fortune 500 company be a thing. You can compromise these devices not on the spinning platter, but they're also computers themselves. You can break them. But we've decided, no, we like it that way because we can break other people's systems and we'll leave our own ones vulnerable in exchange. So every time I see exceptional access, I see holes left in fundamental infrastructure for our society that...
So Dan, I hear you. Well, why can't I just as easily say Apple left a hole in every product that they make so that they could get back in and change the code?
Because they fix it. And if they didn't fix it, those holes would be closed.
You're saying they made exceptional access, but they were really careful about it.
Well,
and that's what I think. Isn't that what Jim Comey is suggesting?
What I'm saying is, so if you look at the actual world, you see ad blockers all over the place, which is once a technology is used against the user, users fight back. And if users fought back by going ahead and shutting off automatic updating, we would not have a world where security holes ever closed. Now, that might be good for certain actors, but it would not be good for society as a whole.
So fair enough that it would be dumb to turn off automatic updates.
Or to
would reduce your security. But by and large, most people are not worried about the need for security against law enforcement. And so they're not going to turn off their automatic updates.
There's 1 million people a month using Tor. There's a lot of people out there that are genuinely worried about what's going on. And if we actually did go ahead and affect one of these update infrastructures, because it's been suggested by quite a few, people would turn it off. And a world where people are not patching their security holes is where we were back when we had worms regularly taking down the computing infrastructure.
So let me ask you a question. I hadn't thought about that, a world where the people don't patch. Isn't that their lookout? You know, on the whole, if you patch, you're secure, but there's a possibility of law enforcement access. And if you don't patch, you're just screwed. So you've done something very stupid in the name of some theoretical privacy. What's wrong with a world where we say, yeah, you have to take law enforcement access with the updates?
Because your data is not in the hands of just you. It's in the hands of a large number of parties. And if any of those parties are opting out of the security technologies that we've developed over the last 10 years, then you are vulnerable. There is a herd immunity effect that we absolutely have to protect, and I keep seeing it get threatened.
Yeah, I think one thing we look at the topic of the whole debate was national security and encryption, right? And when we think about national security, it's very easy to say, okay, the U.S. national security. What about other nefarious actors, third parties who may be enemies of the state, who now may have access to that same data? And what implications does that create? So I think it's important to look at it much more holistically.
That's a fair question, and this was Apple's argument. Bad countries will get access to this, but that's an argument against having an update key, because bad countries can get access to Apple's update key as well, can't they?
Yeah, I think that's certainly.
But we still have update keys because we think the security risks of not having them, the social risks of not having updates, are worse than the risk of China breaking in and stealing Apple's key. So my point here is, the argument that it's impossible, it's brain dead to ask for this, no responsible cryptographer would do this, is just wrong, because responsible cryptographers help to build the Apple update system.
Yeah, I think when I say it's technically infeasible, I mean you cannot meet sort of what cryptographers have considered to be proper security requirements if you enable it. There's no debate about that. That's not something that's even up. That's a black and white issue. There's also a deeper shades of gray issue, which I think you're raising, which is this is not just a binary decision around do we allow it or not allow it. Ultimately, there are many forces at play. It's a decision along a continuum about how you deal with those different forces. You obviously have national security interests, you have law enforcement interests on the one hand, you've got privacy, you've got security, you've got commercial interests on the other, and we have to strike an appropriate balance between those two interests. And I think what we end up missing in that debate is I think that you have the policymakers on the one hand who may not fully appreciate or understand the technical ramifications of enabling something like exceptional access. And I think that's when we end up going down this very slippery slope. We assume that it's much easier to do because it sounds so simple, exceptional access. It's a very simple thing to say, but it's very ostensibly simple. In reality, the implementation
so
of
it's
something
hard,
like that is
but
much
that's
more
quite different from the claim that it's a magic unicorn.
No, I want to be very clear here.
Possible.
So I want to be very clear here. When I say when I'm not saying it's a magic unicorn, I'm saying that if you were to try to develop a system around exceptional access, here are the challenges you've got to overcome. So I said perfect forward secrecy, out the door. Authenticated encryption, a very good practice, out the door. Things you just simply cannot do cryptographically and enable exceptional access. The
So
second
I
element
think
is the procedural.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to. I think labels in this discussion tend to matter a little, and there's two that have been sort of floating around in this discussion that I just want to take a moment to pause on. One is law enforcement access, because it suggests something nefarious. And just to be clear, what we want is a situation that the government wants is where you can get a court order, search warrant or something else, and go to a provider, and the provider gives you the information that is requested or ordered in the court order. And how the provider does it, it can be a black box, right? And that's where we get to this what we say is there is no one size fits all. It depends on the product, depends on the service, and the providers are in the best position to figure it out. So whether it's auto update or some other mechanism, the provider is in the best position. That's number one. The second is exceptional access. And every time it's been used here, it's always been used in conjunction with law enforcement requests. And I think, Stewart, you were getting at this a little bit earlier. And a question back to the panel is, again, we see a plethora of companies out there, whether in the corporate space or in the consumer space, that use encryption yet maintain access to content. Do you all consider that exceptional access? Because I think what folks in the sort of general audience might think is exceptional access is only for law enforcement, when in fact it's much broader.
I think that's a fair question. So we've already established that all those phones we have actually have exceptional access for Apple, and now they probably also have exceptional access for our employers. Let me ask Patrick to address that, and then Dan and Zuli.
So I think if you're in the corporate space, there are much different pressures involved with regard to maintaining access, especially within publicly traded companies, maintaining access to official data by employees of your company. So I would consider that as a kind of separate thing from this.
But that's because there's costs associated. For example, if there's insiders in the company that are doing something nefarious, companies want to be able to see that happen. And so I think your point is there's costs to not having access to content. And so we're broadening it back out. That's part of what we're saying as law enforcement, is that there are costs, public safety and national security costs, when law enforcement with appropriate court authorization is unable to access critical information.
So Zuli, all of those companies are giving up perfect forward secrecy, they're giving up authenticated encryption, and they think it's worth it. They're actually spending money to give that up. Why shouldn't the social value of solving crimes also lead us to say we're going to make the same compromise?
That's a fair question, and I think it's important. I think we just sort of talked about this earlier. They are distinct situations. You've got to look at the overall operational impact of doing this in a more contained environment and the risks associated with that versus trying to make it a much more global and extensive environment. So I wouldn't disagree. There are certainly situations in which it is helpful to have that type of access. I mean, obviously we have security is not just crypto. It's one of the first things I learned after doing my PhD was crypto is actually not the real reason systems get broken. I could try to break the crypto. I could also buy a six-pack of beer to the guy driving the backup takes the data center and probably get the data much faster that way. Or I could simply send the person an email and say, hey, give me your password, not in those exact words, but something like it, and I'll probably succeed some fraction of the time.
Patrick, we won't ask you to comment on that.
And so the point here being that, ultimately these are trade-offs, but I think that what we have to do is we have to make sure that we account for all those critical questions and are comfortable with all the answers to those questions before we really proceed down that debate. And I think that's something we haven't done when we've looked at it at a much broader scale yet. I think companies can do it at a much smaller scale, and it's a much more tenable problem to attack in that capacity.
So I don't want to get too far down this road without acknowledging the argument that Apple made, which is that there are bad governments, not just good governments, and that they will take advantage of whatever access mechanism we create. And the implication was that Apple would never do a deal with a bad government, which is, as far as I can tell, poppycock, because they've done a deal of the worst sort with one of the worst governments. That is to say, with the Chinese, they've installed a classified algorithm in every Chinese iPhone. Patrick, do you know anything about exactly what crypto policy is in China and what kinds of encryption they're foisting on people through the iPhone?
Well, as I understand it, those algorithms were declassified.
They have been declassified?
I think so.
Okay, and have they been examined for backdoors?
Yes, to some extent. Now, as Dan said, when you look at sort of telecom infrastructure algorithms, they tend to be
Happy.
Well, let's just say the telcos have no inherent incentive to secure user data. They have an inherent incentive to secure billing and access. And so there's nothing there to discourage them from cooperating with whatever nation states want to degrade their crypto algorithms, or even just give them crypto algorithms. And so
this was
all around the
Apple.
world.
They're standing up for our rights everywhere around the world.
No. I mean, if you look at the early GSM algorithms, they were a little bit obvious. If you look at the more recent algorithms, it's not quite so obvious. If you look at there's one ZUC, I think, that was one of these Chinese algorithms. It's got linearity all the way through it. It's not. I mean, I haven't done a formal cryptanalysis of it, but just looking at the picture, I can see ways to tease it apart. There's another algorithm, SMS4, which is basically a Feistel cipher, and it's quite possible there are properties in the S boxes that people haven't realized except for the designers.
Will you agree?
It would not be surprising to see that being exploitable by the Chinese, but harder to exploit by others. In fact, it'd be surprising for it not to be the case. The thing is, who are you going to talk to with that crypto algorithm? Are you talking to a Chinese cell phone tower? If so, you're talking to a Chinese cell phone tower you've already lost. Okay?
Yeah, I think you have to keep perspective. That's a very, very good point. And I think, look, historically, I mean, there's been a lot of, somehow crypto and conspiracy theorists have always sort of been attracted to each other for many years. In fact, I remember back in the 70s when DES was being designed, and there was a conspiracy theory that, the NSA was involved. They had made some changes to the S-Box and DES. The conspiracy theorists came out and said, oh, they're trying to put a backdoor, X, Y, and Z. And then many years later, it came out that, in fact, what they had done was actually hardened DES, made it more secure against an attack known as differential cryptanalysis, which the public community hadn't known about, but that the NSA had figured out many, many years before in advance. So they, in fact, had made it more secure. So I think, the NSA, they're not monoliths, they're mosaics.
Yeah, but
That's
we're talking about China. These are the guys who built audio capability into their equivalent of EasyPass and sold it to everybody in Hong Kong, so they could just turn it on and listen to you as you drove.
Right, but I think this is a perfect case where we don't, we haven't looked, I mean, in some cases we have looked carefully. There's some really bad cipher designs out there. I've also seen a lot of bad US cipher designs as well as Chinese ones. I don't think it's a problem that's limited to one particular nationality or country. But there's also a lot of good Chinese cryptographers out there, those who've contributed to the academic community for years and have identified a lot of interesting ideas within the community. So I think we can't look at this in a very monolithic and put a single label and say it's China is bad, US is good. I think you got to be much more nuanced and look more carefully and do a deeper investigation and say, look, is this really a bad algorithm? Is this algorithm going to be used for encrypting some critical data in a critical setting, and should we examine it more carefully?
Let me ask Dan.
So it comes down to engineering requirements. Do you want it to be good, or do you want it to be good enough for some vague value of good enough? And what you keep seeing with these closed crypto designs is invariably there's an engineering requirement. Yeah, make it good so maybe those guys can't get it, but we still need to be able to break through with our magic, highly funded crypto knowledge and a couple acres of computing capacity. And as it happens, none of that crap ever works. It just doesn't. Your ability to model your attacker's cryptographic capabilities is poor.
And
That's
it
the
has a
reality.
very short half-life.
Yeah.
So I think most people would agree that if you try to just sort of choose exactly the right key length, it's not going to work as a way of getting access that only you can get. But I think Patrick said there are certainly other ways in which you can give yourself an access advantage that others will have difficulty getting. NSA has been accused of that fairly often. Dan, let me ask you this question. Talking about authoritarian regimes, I think you could make the argument that what Apple has done by protecting access and refusing to let people in if they don't have the passcode has been to disadvantage Western countries that respect the rights of criminal defendants, but that anybody else who's arrested with an iPhone is just going to be taken in a back room and beaten up until they give up their passcode. Which it will certainly be easy to tell whether they gave up the right passcode because you just put it in and it either opens or it doesn't.
Wait a minute, which category are you placing the U.S. in?
I am putting the category in the category of countries that respect the rights of criminal defendants.
Oh, surprising.
Well, all right. Name 3 countries that you would put in a position of respecting the rights of criminal defendants more.
Ooh,
Yeah,
Netherlands?
I thought.
I can't think of many.
Yeah, exactly. So on a realist spectrum, the U.S. is clearly on the side of respecting the rights of criminal defendants more than, say, everybody's favorite totalitarian or authoritarian regime. But authoritarian regimes will have access to iPhones whenever they want. Whenever they catch people with the iPhone, they'll get access. Only the West will be unable to get access. Does that sound like an intelligent policy, Dan?
You know, I'd like to point out the whole concept of the Bill of Rights is here's a bunch of things that might be convenient for the government that we're just not going to do. Because that makes for a poor society to live in.
Not without
and
a court order.
in exchange, we get the best and brightest from around the world getting the heck out of their authoritative regimes and coming here. The whole point of the United States is we don't do this stuff. Like, that's the idea.
Well,
and we profit quite a bit
just
from
to
it.
be clear, I mean, we're talking about court orders and search warrants. So the requirements of the Fourth Amendment, and frankly, laws that Congress put on, like the Wiretap Act, which actually have higher requirements than the Fourth Amendment, are being satisfied. So that's the situation we're talking about, where we've already satisfied our legal obligations and gotten a neutral judge, neutral magistrate on a particular showing of probable cause, reason to believe some individual has been involved in criminal activity. So that's what we're talking about here. It's important to keep that in mind.
So let's talk about what we're actually talking about here, because you get a tremendous amount of cooperation. I've personally been involved in these sorts of matters with Apple, with Microsoft. Tech has supported law enforcement ever since it started getting into the communication game. However, we are at the point now where there's a desire to make it literally impossible for the devices and systems that we build, that we deploy, that we sell, that we support, making it impossible for those systems to block you. And that's concerning because we do have general purpose computing. We do provide computers that then other people can write software for. The most popular package, you want to talk about engineering failures and successes. We all used to use a protocol called Telnet. It was an unencrypted way of managing the computers we use to build our, frankly, to design our culture now, to build the infrastructure for it. And we stopped using Telnet because it was wildly unsafe, and we started using SSH. Which is encrypted, it has forward secrecy, it is the very definition of the sort of software that is incredibly difficult to build under a Feinstein-Burr regime. And, I look at SSH and I wonder, What did it give us? Well, it gave us the cloud. Do you think you could have information technology infrastructure that lived all around the world if you couldn't have secure encrypted links to it all over the place? And I wonder, is someone going to visit the creators of OpenSSH? Is someone going to visit a guy named Theo Durat and say, dude, you have to go ahead and give us extraordinary access? It would kill the software long before you'd ever get that.
I do think that we ought to spend a little time on Burr Feinstein. I know that Kiran can't or thinks it would be imprudent to comment on pending legislation that the Justice Department is prohibited from taking a position on. But let's talk about Burr Feinstein, because that has been the source of a lot of harsh technical analyses. Brain dead, I think, was the nicest thing somebody said about it.
Seems accurate.
But let me ask this. Kiran, can you describe what it is that Burr Feinstein actually calls for?
Sorry, you want me to
Yeah,
describe it?
are you comfortable doing that? I'm happy to do it. Okay. So as I read it, it's a performance standard. If you make or provide a system and it encrypts the content, then when law enforcement brings you a court order, you have to be able to provide decrypted, intelligible content. And it essentially says that everybody who is in the encryption business also needs to be in the decryption business. It's a tough standard, but I think we've established we're doing it now for companies. We're doing it for Apple so they can update.
So first off, I want to be clear. The legislation is not constrained merely to direct encryption providers. It very explicitly says if your software is then used, if you license your software such that other software is using encryption, you have to provide a break as well. Now, they're trying to make you think about the App Store, but really all software is licensed, even open source. And we just had a U.S. attorney outright state that open source encryption software should probably be banned.
It goes beyond software. Any method for rendering data unintelligible. So clearly at this point, Congress themselves would be in violation for rendering the very law unintelligible. They have a method for doing that.
You've spent too much time with the congressional record, I think. So the objections to Burr Feinstein included a number of concerns. One of them was open source. It's easy enough to say if a company provides something, we're going to serve the court order on the company, but open source could be written by hundreds of people, and hundreds of companies could have contributed. Who do you serve the order on? No one's going to answer that because everybody would prefer to.
You're entirely correct. It is logistically an infeasible proposition. The advantage of open processes is it's just genuinely difficult to hide your, by the way, it has to only be so secure, good enough. Someone's going to openly point out, what are you doing? Why is this hole here?
Yeah, I have to say, I suspect that the encryption code is probably provided by somebody, and it's almost certainly a company because 90 or 95% of most open source now comes from corporate contributors. You probably could track that person.
There's a lot of contributors to OpenSSL. There's hundreds of crypto projects from 53 countries. This is a technology, this is a genie that's out of the bottle.
Okay. So let me ask about the other big argument against Burr Feinstein, which is that it will cripple U.S. industry. I'm puzzled by that, and I'd like somebody to answer this question. Anybody who sells something in the United States is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and can get a court order. It doesn't matter whether they're based in Beijing or Berlin or New York. All of them can be served with orders, and if they don't obey the order, they can be punished for failing to obey the order. I don't see why this is somehow going to single out U.S. technology and make it suspect around the world.
I do notice that a lot of American firms are having to move their data offshore. So a lot of Microsoft data is having to go to Ireland.
Yeah,
I do notice there's a huge fight against that.
People are worried about the fact that it's located here, but if you're buying a product from a company based in Berlin that has encryption and that company makes a boatload of money in the United States, they are subject to U.S. jurisdiction and they will be subject to this requirement, won't they?
What if you're buying a product or service in Berlin? Suddenly you can buy from local EU manufacturers, but you don't dare buy from US manufacturers because you know there are explicit backdoors built into it.
So you can buy from somebody who doesn't have enough talent or market share to sell any products in the United States.
If China was saying the sort of things that we were saying, I am sure you would be much stronger against buying China.
No, I don't think I could be much stronger against buying Chinese products. And yet, you know.
Do you have a cell phone?
Let me
I mean, like any?
Yeah, and probably one of the fastest growing phones, so some of the fastest growing market shares for phones are Chinese products that, come on, are almost certainly buggered. Let's get real. And I don't hear a lot of consumers saying, oh, well, I wouldn't buy that phone because it's probably buggered. They're just buying it because it's $50 cheaper. And that suggests that that's going to be the impact in the world markets of this requirement, even if it did differentially affect US products, which I don't think it does.
Somebody's going to figure out how to build secure code at scale. And that somebody's going to own the next Silicon Valley. That's the bottom line. It is actually possible to write secure code. This nihilistic security model of we just can't figure it out and oh well is going to go away because someone's going to get it working. So
well, let me ask you
if we
good.
keep spending all of our energy arguing about things being possibly too secure, when are we going to start talking seriously about how we're going to deal with the stuff that's not secure enough? This is taking the oxygen from the real security debate. It's ridiculous.
So I would actually think that, you know, yes, it would be wonderful if we figured out a way to write truly secure code and whatnot. I think there are tools that can help us get part of the way there, and maybe somebody will figure out how to get that last element of it. But I think there's also a much broader problem in security. It's not always about the code. In fact, you know, a very small fraction of people who get compromised because of a software vulnerability. It's typically things like a spear phishing attack or social engineering and whatnot. So I think that, you know, we are dealing with a very complex, security is a very complex problem. And that's, you know, as I said earlier, like we haven't quite figured out how to build secure systems yet. I wasn't being facetious. I mean, look at all these companies that get compromised repeatedly. There's reasons why companies like RSA are in business to try to help people become more and more secure. This has been a long-standing issue for many, many years. I don't see us solving it overnight. We are trying to make it better over time, but I think it's a journey, not a point in time.
So I do want to respond to you on one point.
Sure.
Where you say that spear phishing is not a technical problem. It absolutely is.
Oh, I didn't say it was not a technical problem, but it's...
Spear phishing is when, like, your CEO, you think you're getting a mail from your CEO saying, hey, can you send all the W-2s somewhere? And you're like, well, it looks like an email from my CEO. I'll go ahead and do that. And people think this is a pure social problem. No. In the real world, your CEO walks up to you and you recognize the person. You see their face, you hear their voice. You actually have a remarkable amount of strong authentication, which we've pretended it's the same when it's pixels on your screen. And it's not. What's missing is a sort of cryptographic identifier. What's missing is links to the individual. What's missing is an entire flow which could absolutely be technically stronger and isn't. And we're just blaming people because, my God, we love to blame people, and we're not blaming weak technology. Engineers have failed.
So let me first of all, I want to make it clear, I don't think, you know, I'm not saying spear phishing isn't a technical problem. There are certainly technical countermeasures. But at the end of the day, remember, cryptographic protocols are between machines, but there's humans on both ends of those machines. Let's take a look at something like digital signing. Okay, let's say you digitally signed everything, you did all these wonderful cryptographic techniques. So now what? If I received an email that's digitally signed, am I going to take my calculator out, my computer out, and verify the signature manually? No. I'm going to look at a piece of user interface that maybe is a check marks on the email that says, oh, this is digitally signed. I'm not going to expect someone to be a mathematician to verify it. I'll look for the check mark, and now you have to worry about what if somebody spoofs a check mark or puts a different check mark. So at the end of the day, there's this last last 12 inches, so to speak, between the computer and the human. Now, I will absolutely not blame humans. I'm not going to say I can't believe the end user did this. I think we can do a better job of building better systems. But what I'm saying is that there's always going to be a lot of difficulty in trying to design truly secure systems. There's many ways you can compromise a system, not just from the perspective of a technical vulnerability. You can look for other elements as well that can be compromised.
So this takes us into territory that Jim Comey has explored, using all of his salary for the next 7.5 years. He purchased a mechanism for getting access to the iPhone in question. Is that the solution? I've heard serious technical and libertarian people say, no, the solution is we just need to keep spending more on access, hacking these systems, and if law enforcement would invest in that, they wouldn't have to bother poor Apple with requests that they devote 3 engineers for 3 weeks.
It's at best a short-term solution to the FBI's specific problem with a much longer-term problem that it introduces.
I would actually say
Yes,
it's actually it's even worse than that in some ways because as I started at the beginning, the going dark challenge is much broader, and so the particular method used on one particular phone, which is, again, a combination of iPhone 5C and iOS 9. I mean, that's a very, very specific, hardware, software combination. And so, it's expensive and time consuming. I mean, even in that case, as we've said, there was worldwide attention on that case that spurred some sort of market innovation, and it still took over 4 months, right? It's just not a scalable solution. It doesn't work, and I think the director talked a little bit about that this morning. It doesn't work across different platforms, doesn't even work across some of the different product lines, and so it's hard to see how that is an overall solution to the problem, even at the federal level. And then if you add in the 18,000 plus state and locals who also deal with various challenges from encryption and going dark in general, it's hard to see how it solves the whole.
So Kiran, if it's not a
problem.
solution, why did he do it?
Because, again, as I think actually the director said this morning, we have to use every lawful tool in our toolbox. And so, when a third party came to us and provided us, showed us this method, we tested it, it found that it worked. I mean, ultimately, our goal is to do a full and complete investigation in the San Bernardino attack, and that's what we're doing. And so, we had lawful authority to use it, we used it, and that's what we'll do in every case, where we'll always use whatever appropriate legal means we have to move forward with our investigations and our prosecutions.
Dan, are you going to make it a consensus that buying exploits is not the solution for law enforcement?
I think the acquisition of exploits by offense-oriented organizations is inevitable. I think it's a little silly to pretend that they're not. It's silly to pretend that they're not going to buy the exploits, and silly to pretend that they're not going to use them. And it is super silly to pretend they're ever going to share their exploits.
But it's not a scalable solution.
It's certainly not a scalable solution. And where I think we need to be spending a lot more money is on the defensive side. Yes, there's going to be offensive organizations that are going to do their exploit game. That's just the reality of it. But where's the millions of dollars for, okay, let's find these bugs? And frankly, from a larger, how are we building a society scale, we need iPhones that aren't crackable. We need Android phones that aren't crackable. We're not getting $1 million to go crack those things.
So let me use that to pivot to try to explain my earlier attack on engineers in general, because it's not an attack on engineers, but on the limited focus of engineers on the idea that there's a technical solution to all this. In fact, almost all the security problems we have in the world and all the security solutions we've come up with end up depending on punishment, deterrence, the vulnerability of the attacker to social discipline in some fashion. And what I am astonished by is the reluctance of engineers to build that into systems, of which the reluctance to recognize that law enforcement has an interest in getting access is a part. It's like this profound blind spot on the part of the engineers that the rest of us, I think, don't have.
You know, I think the fair thing to say is the vast majority of this sort of crime that is dealt with by prevention. We can go ahead and find people all day and they don't get busted. You can go ahead and have a whole legitimate series of reasons about jurisdictions and difficulties and multilateral agreements. But at the end of the day, when we want to prevent hackers from breaking into something, like when we want to make that thing the data not get lost, we have to engineer our way out of the problem. We don't deal with buildings burning by prosecuting more arsonists. We deal with it with building codes.
So I would disagree. I think that, safes prevent people from stealing money, but they don't really work by being absolutely impervious. You're lucky. The best safe you can buy is going to last 2 hours, 3 hours. If ISIS takes over your town, they're going to get the money. And what we're really saying is this safe will prevent access for long enough for the police to show up, not forever. And yet, computer engineers seem to be trying to design systems that will guarantee that you never need to call the police. I just don't see that's realistic.
Actually, I wouldn't characterize that at all. I mean, when we look at security, we think of it as very holistic, right? There's many elements towards improving security. There's certainly technology elements, there's people elements, process elements, law enforcement elements, and we have to think about how to fit those in an integrated fashion. But ultimately, we also have to think about how to make it work in a somewhat safe fashion. And I think the challenge that we're running into is not that we don't believe that we want to not help law enforcement. I mean, I've personally helped law enforcement. I've taken calls from detectives and literally to my office phone and helped them out because I believe that we want to make the world safer. I think we have a common goal in mind. I think the challenge becomes that we often aren't able to achieve certain elements of that. And even though, again, it sounds easy to say, but then when you actually work down to the technical details, the process details, the operational details, you incur significant levels of complexity that have to be addressed.
I think the conversation would be different if law enforcement themselves showed themselves to be more trustworthy stewards of our public trust. And I mean, this is true internationally, but it's particularly true in the US. You have a legal system in which law enforcement officers can lie and perjure themselves with impunity. They have conventional weapons, they have military weapons, they have chemical weapons, they have black ops torture sites that they take people to. And they're using all of the above, particularly against the African American community in an architecture of oppression. And now we're talking about giving them the ability to eviscerate personal privacy and location data and communication data between private individuals. Why are we considering giving them more hammers with which to beat us?
So we do have a democracy, and the democracy has voted for the policies that we are
public
carrying
opinion
out.
has no correlation with public policy.
And your argument, it's not unlike the argument that the NRA would put forward, is that we should give everybody guns and then the police forces can't oppress them. We may find ourselves in that world, but I'm not sure saying we'd like to have the policies made by every individual, including every individual criminal, is a better solution than trying to fix what you believe is a failure of our democracy.
I think that's the first time I've ever been compared to the the NRA in that way.
The most interesting thing I think I heard on this panel was when you expressed revulsion to the E-ZPass system, and I think it was Hong Kong?
Yes.
Where you talked about, I can't believe that they put an audio recorder in every single one of these cars. And I just sort of think of this as an interesting statement, because what you're saying is, wow, maybe we don't want a society where every possible little bit of information that could be useful to an investigation is obviously being recorded at all times, because at some point maybe it'll be useful. At some point maybe we want a society where it's okay for private communications to occur. Maybe you don't go ahead and enforce 100% absolute compliance on penalty of a government being able to re-engineer your product. Maybe there's other ways to live. You know, even going back before the establishment of the United States, there's always been a principle in common law that you cannot force a husband to testify against his wife, or vice versa. This goes all the way back, I think, to the Magna Carta. And the whole concept is, we would rather let murderers go free than violate that sort of dignity. This is how you build societies. And I feel like in our hunger for every last bit of following every law enforcement path, we're starting to interfere with how do you build a society people actually want to live in.
So I'm often reminded by people on your side of the debate that George Washington used code, that Jefferson was a cryptographer, and yet somehow they left it out of the Constitution. Instead, they said if a court decides there's probable cause and issues a warrant, they can search the papers and effects of individuals, and they have no automatic protection. That's the line we drew, and for 225 years, that's the line we have observed. You're making a very radical argument that we ought to change that, and I'm not convinced by events of the last 25 years that that's true.
The argument that I'm making, and the argument that I think a lot of people are making, is that there's a tremendous amount of cooperation that is possible in the status quo that does not involve granting final engineering authority to law enforcement agencies. That it is okay to release technology that people can build encryption technology on top of, even if it turns out that you're not able to release the keys, provide extraordinary access, and whatnot. That is an acceptable thing to do. That there are trade-offs involving, hey, wait a second, maybe law enforcement is not, because keep in mind, the amount of information in your cell phone, that's your life, that's your identity. Like, that's not your papers and effects. As far as the rest of the internet knows, that's you. That's you to the degree that you're the CEO and you can mail someone and say, provide all the W-2s, and it happens. The amount of risk that is available, that is exposed when this level of access is granted to third parties, even law enforcement third parties, is astonishing.
And the level of risk when you give modern capabilities for instantaneous global communications to terrorists is also an increase in the risk that we faced 30 years ago. I will ask if there's anybody else who wants to speak, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
One thing, we've talked about whether you can or can't do it or should. We haven't asked the question of is it even worth it fundamentally. I mean, one of the fundamental arguments is that we can access encryption technology pretty easily, right? It's not like it's hard to find. I can take AES, a very good algorithm, and study for many, many years. Probably going to do a good job of encrypting my data. If I really wanted private communication, I could do that. So I don't think that whether you allow exceptional access or not, it is still feasible for people to be able to encrypt their data. And I think we have to always keep that in mind. And it's got to be one of the dimensions along which we evaluate this overall argument of whether or not we should allow exceptional access, whether it's a good idea, whether it makes sense in particular contexts.
Kiran? Patrick?
Go ahead. Okay. I think that Stu raised a very good point earlier about how in authoritarian countries, people are disadvantaged because they can be beaten for their PIN to get into their iPhone. And one of the solutions that people come up with when they know they're sending troops into a hostile environment where that kind of thing might happen is to give them a coercion pin that gives access to something that doesn't contain the real juicy data, but contains something. And I think that is a market pressure then. If that is the case, there's a market pressure now for Apple and Google and other device manufacturers to build that kind of capability into their systems. And then there won't be this sort of disconnect between authoritarian and non-authoritarian countries.
Kiran?
So I guess end with 2 points. One is that as law enforcement, we'll obviously continue our job of investigating and prosecuting folks using all appropriate lawful means. The second piece is, we hope we're out there educating folks about how this going dark challenge is affecting us. Our job in some ways is to tell folks that the tools that the American people through the Congress have given us to protect public safety and national security are not as effective as you think that they are. And so that, what we hope, is sort of spurred this discussion. And I think, I want to echo a point that I think was made earlier today, which is that, where we end up is part of the conversation, but I think it's important to have that conversation so we just don't drift to a place by default, and that's where we just end up. So we at least make a knowing choice that, whatever the costs and benefits are, that's where we're going to be. And as part of that conversation, I do think that it's important to keep in mind what is actually being asked and to avoid some of the hyperbole, some of it that we've heard a little bit on this panel. But again, we're talking about situations where we've gone to a neutral judge, we've satisfied the requirements we have to satisfy, generally probable cause, and we've gotten a court order. And that's a situation that the going dark challenge is really focused on.
So I agree with you. The conversation ought to continue, and I am struck every time I come to this conference by the fact that practically everybody who's in the audience could just as easily be up here delivering remarks at least as thoughtful as mine. And so why don't we continue the conversation? If there are questions from the audience, just come to the mic and ask them.
Hi there, Simon Gibson from Gigamon. Really good panel. I actually agree with a lot of the things I heard, especially the ones about not necessarily wanting to live in a country where every single law is perfectly enforceable. I for one think that there should be a place where people can go dark when they need to. The question I have though is this all feels like a lot like a distraction in terms of some of the real questions about our privacy. This is the golden age of metadata and of information that we're throwing off our phones, what cell towers we go to, where we tweet, where we eat, when we check in, where we swipe credit cards. So the real question I think is actually, what's on our phones? Like, what data do we have? And as consumers, aren't we sort of entitled to understand some of that? And mightn't we be better consumers if we could control what data we were sharing? Isn't it possible that law enforcement would actually get a benefit if I knew I was going somewhere where I was particularly afraid, or I knew I had some reason that was risky? I would hit a button on my phone and law enforcement could then track, but I don't actually know what's on my phone. So my question is this debate of whether or not to unlock a little bit of a distraction, and the real question is sort of the opacity about what's really going on with our devices?
Who wants to take that?
I'll take a crack at this. We just heard a little bit about how our vehicles have gone from mostly mechanical devices to an extraordinary ecosystem designed to entertain and comfort and do all sorts of things which interact with the outside world in unknown ways. Our technology has just gotten enormously complicated. And even trying to explain all the things that it does. I mean, no one can read a privacy policy, but it's actually in there roughly whatever's going in and out. What I can tell you is that this isn't a problem that we solve by listing everything out or trying to do consumer education. It's a problem we set up with norms. And at some point, there's going to be a conflict between the norms that consumers might want and the norms that law enforcement desires. And that's where I get really worried, because that is where you get every car recording every word at all times. Because believe me, there's the battery power, there's the storage, there's the computation. We could do it tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on that point, I think it's a highly complex problem. It's not a new problem. I mean, years ago, we had the web, we had EULAs. How many people read their EULAs when they install software? I bet you it tells you what data is leaving your computer, but who's going to read 70 pages of legalese? It makes no sense. I think it's just the same problem now. I think it's gotten much more complex because of the fact that we have many more devices and many more considerations, but I don't think there's an easy answer where we can educate the general public on every single thing that's going to happen, and I think we have to think about more novel approaches to be able to address it.
I'm getting the signal that there's only room for time for two more questions, and there's two people in line, so let's move on.
Okay. Thank you for the panel. I'm Chris Riley from KGSS. And I just had a question regarding national security and law enforcement. So many supporters of magic keys, encryption backdoors, tend to conflate national security and law enforcement. Do you believe law enforcement and national security are interchangeable? Does law enforcement fall under national security? And to what level? And doesn't the vulnerable implementation of encryption affect more users and present a greater threat than the going dark problem?
Yeah, so I guess the premise, let me just take the last point first, because I think the premise suggests that somehow the department or the FBI is somehow against encryption, is trying to weaken encryption, and that's just not accurate. The department and the FBI are both for encryption. We actually recommend people use encryption in part because of the information security and data security and some of the what you've heard on the panel today. But I think the specifics and really where the rubber hits the road for us is the situation where you implement encryption in a very specific way so that only the end user has access to the information, because that's the situation where when we go with a court order or a search warrant to a company, they say, we can't help you. And that's where the public safety challenge is for law enforcement.
Not to put you find a point
Can
on.
I make one point real quick?
Yeah.
So the vulnerable encryption standards tend to be public and researched by cryptographers like the two on the stage and other people that are interested in that. The vulnerable implementation of encryption is what we'll be taking advantage of to get access to that data. So what you're asking for is that vulnerable implementation.
So again, I'd push back on the premise, and I do so by looking at just what's out there today. I mean, you take cloud services, for example. There's a number of different cloud services. They use encryption, and yet they maintain access to the content, and I don't think that's because the encryption algorithm they use is vulnerable.
Okay, last question.
It's a question for Mr. Raj. My name is Elias Grohl with Foreign Policy Magazine. There's a report out this afternoon that the FBI isn't going to be turning over the exploit in the San Bernardino Apple case to the vulnerabilities equities process. Wondering first off whether that's something that you can confirm, and if so, if this report is true that the FBI is not turning over this information, I have a question about how this kind of data that's extracted from this phone is used in a courtroom process. If the FBI, as Director Comey hinted this afternoon, doesn't know enough about the forensic tool in order to turn it over to the vulnerabilities equities process, how does that square with the Department of Justice's responsibility to preserve the evidence that's extracted from that phone? In short, if the Justice Department doesn't understand the tool that it's using to obtain this evidence, how is that then used potentially in a courtroom, or can it be used in a courtroom?
But when you say in short, it means you're stopping. So why don't we say,
That was the end of my question.
I think we've gotten the question.
I think I got to the point.
So in terms of your, I guess the first part of your question, I just defer you to what the director of the FBI said this morning, which is that the FBI is close to working out that question, but they've not announced anything to my knowledge. Of course, I've been here and in the back room for most of the day, so I'm not familiar with the report that you mentioned. And then, second, to your second sort of part of the question, which is, how does the information get used in a court? I mean, that's really up to the particular court. It's going to depend on the facts and circumstances of the particular case, so it's hard to answer in the abstract.
Okay, so 30 seconds from each of the others. If you were the FBI director, would you turn this vulnerability over to Apple?
I think absolutely. I would work with them, and just the way that the typical process works is you do responsible disclosure and you try to make the world safer.
Patrick?
I'd say probably. I think the FBI went about this in a particularly stupid way, and publicly berating a company and saying, if you do this, if you comply with this, then you will be ridiculed by your consumers, and if you do not comply with this, you'll be ridiculed by us, was a particularly bad way of going about it.
Dan?
I think I would be at a different agency that was much more focused on a defensive organization. And I basically say, okay, there's clearly a vulnerability here. Let's find it, let's fix it. But I wouldn't expect the FBI to do it.
All right, so with that Sherman-esque statement that he will never accept appointment to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I ask that you thank our panel for a terrific presentation.